And it's my great pleasure to invite Colin Humphreys today, who's Goldsmith Professor of Material Sciences here at Cambridge University. You've each got some little mini biographies in the folder, and if you see that, you'll see that he's won enormous numbers of prizes and honorary degrees and all that sort of thing, which I won't read out to embarrass him, but you can read them. Significant things, I suppose, he's president of the Institute of Materials at the moment, and he used to be president of Christians in Science before he passed on to the next person. So he's had a long involvement in the study of science and religion. And he told me once that you wrote a Nature paper, didn't you, on the date of the crucifixion in 1983, which I think is your most cited paper, isn't it? Even though you've got lots of very highly cited scientific papers too. So that gives a measure of his involvement across both science and religion fields. So today he's going to talk about something else that he's written a very good book on, The Miracles of Exodus, on sale at the back. And he's just writing another book which is updating the date of the crucifixion. Not I think that the date of the crucifixion has changed, but you're putting new evidence into that to tighten up the conclusions even more, which is due next year, this year sometime.
Hopefully
maybe later this year. So next course you come to, maybe he'll talk about that, and you'll hear about that too. But today Colin's talking on miracles, so hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bob, for your very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'll just say at the start, I hope my voice holds out, because I'm suffering a bit, so I shall speak as well as I can. So answer the question of miracles. Miracles, of course, are very well known in public life. This is a greetings card you can buy in many shops in England. I've seen it in a number of shops, and two people have sent me copies, and I bought this at a shop in London. Not a religious shop at all, a normal shop. And the majority of people seeing this card, I guess, will immediately think of Moses and crossing the Red Sea, even though the caption just says, "What do you mean? It's a bit muddy." Right? So there's this instant recognition of this miracle. So miracles, we know. People know about miracles, and they know about miracles like crossing the Red Sea, even in our secular society today. And I sometimes say, just think how much money David Cameron would give for such instant recognition, or how much money Tony Blair would give for such instant recognition in 3,000 years' time, because 3,000 years ago. So, well, this is a popular definition of a miracle, and I appreciate you may not agree with it, but this is what the public think a miracle is, and this is from the web-based encyclopedia, Wikipedia, which is really quite widely used. A miracle can be defined as a violation of natural law by a supernatural being. And that's what people believe, and the key points, and two key points, the violation of the natural law and the supernatural being. And Richard Dawkins says something rather similar. As we'll see here, this is taken from an article he wrote in Forbes magazine. The resurrection, even the Old Testament miracles, are all freely used for religious propaganda, and they are very effective with an audience of unsophisticates and children. So if you believe in miracles, that's what you are. Every one of these miracles amounts to a violation of the normal running of the natural world. And so what I want to do to start with, or one of the things we want to do in this next hour, is just to look at this latter statement. Is it true that every one of these miracles, so he's talking about not only the resurrection, but the Old Testament miracles, all the biblical miracles, is it true that every one of these miracles does amount to a violation of the normal running of the natural world? And rather than talk about miracles in an abstract sort of way, I want to look at 4 specific miracles and analyse them, as it were, through the eyes of science and through the eyes of logic, and see what conclusions we can draw from looking at 4 very different miracles. I've chosen 2 in the Old Testament and 2 in the New Testament. So crossing the Jordan, the climax of the Exodus story, water from the rock, in a sense a minor Old Testament miracle, as we'll see it occurred twice, walking on water in the New Testament, and then the greatest miracle of all, the resurrection. So let's start with crossing the Jordan. It is the last miracle of the Exodus. Can science say anything about it? And does it amount to a violation of the normal running of the natural world? So the miracle is described very simply and very clearly in these two verses in the Old Testament book of Joshua. Now the Jordan is in flood or during harvest, yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap, a great distance away at a town called Adam, in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of the Arabah, which is also called the Dead Sea more popularly, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. So it's a rather remarkable description of this event. And let's just picture the scene. What is the writer of the book of Joshua describing? He's saying that the River Jordan wasn't flowing normally, it was in flood. It was a particularly difficult barrier to cross. And the Israelites were on one side, they wanted to be on the other side, which was their promised land of Canaan. They'd waited about 40 years for this, and now they could see their promised land, but there was this massive raging river separating them from it. So the situation looked pretty hopeless, and as they were standing there with their feet on the water's edge, the river just stopped. It was as if someone upstream had great tap and turned off this river, and the water stopped flowing, and the Israelites just crossed the riverbed in triumph. Now, if you were to read out this story in Hyde Park and Speaker's Corner, as people used to do, I think it may have stopped today, this would be the reaction you'll get. This would be the reaction you'll get in the street if you read out this story. For most people, what a wonderful children's story, what a fabulous fairy tale. And that's a very reasonable reaction because it sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? That they're just standing on the water's edge and the water stops flowing. So that is actually quite a reasonable reaction of people. But can the story be true? And can we know? Can we get information about what may have happened 3,000 years ago? And I'm not going to ask people to vote on this, but the fact is, and we all know this, that most people, even most biblical scholars, believe this story to be a legend, to be a myth, something which didn't really happen, a piece of historical fiction. In a good detective story, that's a story which you don't solve instantly, it's the minor clues which hold the key. The major clues just provide the framework of solving the story, but the minor clues are the important point. And this is true of any problem which is quite difficult to solve. So any problem in science or history, or I believe in the Bible, which is quite difficult to solve, the major clues form the framework, the minor clues hold the key. And in the account of the crossing of the Jordan we just read, there was something which attracted my attention, it's attracted other people's attention as well, which is a very curious statement. And let's put it up again and see if you agree with this and if you could spot this. Let's say this story had been invented, then I think what I would have said, and probably what you would have said, was that as soon as the priest's feet touched the water's edge, the water piled up where they were. But the story doesn't say that. What is strange about this story is the story says the miracle happened somewhere else. The miracle didn't happen where the Israelites and the priests were. The miracle actually happened a great distance away, at a different place. And that's a very strange aspect of the story. And then the writer emphasises this because he tells us where. He says, a town called Adam, and just in case you didn't know where this town called Adam was, he tells us in the vicinity of Zarethan, in the region of Zarethan. So that's where the miracle happened, not where the Israelites were, but a great distance away. And then, just to help us, he says the water stopped flowing all the way down to the Sea of the Arabah. So it really stopped flowing a great distance upstream and didn't continue down at all, so that people could cross over. So that's the curious story. Water stopped flowing not at a town called Alice, but at a town called Adam. So when you read this, particularly through the eyes of science, but if you're just a normal person reading this, I think you would say, not that scientists are not normal people, if you just read this through the, what is this? Cold slowing me up. You would say, what stopped the water flowing at this place called Adam, and can we get any information about this 3,000 years later? And just to make a general point first, what you find throughout the Exodus story is that the writer or writers are paying really careful attention to where the events happen. They're trying to pinpoint the place where events happened. So the writer doesn't just say the Israelites crossed the Jordan, he said they crossed the Jordan opposite Jericho. And then he doesn't just tell us the water stopped flowing a great distance away. He said it was Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan. And then all these places upstream from the Dead Sea. And you find this repeatedly in throughout the Old Testament, that the writer is trying to root events not only in history but also in geography. The problem we have today in reading about these events and other events in the Old Testament is that many places have disappeared. And if you look at a modern map, you will find no place called Adam. There's one exception I'll mention in a moment. But there's essentially no place called Adam on a modern map. If you look at a lot of other Old Testament places, you will not find them named. And they have disappeared. And it's not surprising after 3,000 years. Some places have remained. A few. Jericho. Jericho has been called Jericho today and 3,000 years ago. But places have either disappeared, those communities just been wiped out, or else their names have changed. And this still goes on today, of course. So a place which is now called Mumbai, many of you will know as Bombay, right? So place name changes still go on. We have to understand something about ancient Hebrew to see if we can get a handle on this, because there are certain traditional ways of changing names when names change. And what we have to understand is that in the ancient Hebrew writing, only consonants were used, and many of you will know this. So the original Hebrew writings just used consonants, both for the Bible and other texts. But when they're read, of course, you have to add vowel sounds. You can't just read consonants. And we're going back to this today. You know, in mobile phones, text messages often just consist of consonants. So in a mobile phone, if you write the word text, or your children write the word text, they like to put TXT. And when you read this mentally or out aloud, you know you're going to pronounce it text and not tixt or text or toxt. It's just the context which gives you the pronunciation. And so it is in the ancient Hebrew, they just had consonants, and the way Adam would have been written, just the consonants for the Hebrew for D and the Hebrew for M. So that was a consonantal form, and then this little mark in front was a breathing sound which would have been added. So that's how it would have been written in the original Hebrew. And then when modern Arabic words replace these ancient Hebrew words, there are standard ways in which this is done, and in particular, if you have a breathing sound there, that's usually dropped. The consonants are retained, and that's the key thing, that consonants are retained, and there's often an Arabic ending added. So there's a number of words in the Bible, a number of Hebrew words, which have been converted into Arabic place names, and we can identify them because the consonants remain. And so let's see if we can use this trick, as it were, to identify ancient Adam. Ancient Adam, the key consonants are DM, so we look on a map to see if there's a town with the consonants DM. And in fact there's a place called Damia. So there's the consonants DM, and then this Arabic ending, ya, has been added to it. And there's a place called Damia on the River Jordan, 17 miles north of Jericho. And you may think this is a bit fanciful, in fact it's not fanciful. When I say many scholars, it's the majority of scholars, whether they agree with the crossing of the Jordan or not, the majority of scholars will say yes, ancient Adam is modern Damia. That's just accepted. But can we prove it, as it were? Well, this is what we're talking about. This is a somewhat simplified map of the Middle East region. So this is the Mediterranean Sea. That's the Sea of Galilee up there. This is the Dead Sea. That's the River Jordan running around. And at the end of the Exodus, the Israelites were coming up on this side of the Dead Sea. That's quite clear from the Old Testament. And then they crossed over the Jordan opposite Jericho. So that's where they crossed. And this is where modern Damia is. You may notice I spelled it slightly different here because another interesting problem when you're looking at place names is that there's no standard spelling for lots of Arabic and ancient Hebrew place names, and also Egyptians come to that. People write down the names as they're pronounced. So Damia is sometimes spelled D-A-M-I-A, sometimes D-A-M-I-Y-A, sometimes D-A-M-I-Y-E-H. But that's ancient Damia, and what we're saying is we believe that this is modern Damia, we believe that is ancient by Adam. Well, and I should say there is one map. Today you can go out and buy a popular map. It's the Bartholomew World Map of Israel and Jordan, and it actually has here Damia, and then in brackets Adam after it. I've just reversed those because we're looking back in time, as it were. So ancient Adam, we're suggesting, has become modern Damia. Well, let's now put some science into this. July the 11th, 1927, there was quite a severe earthquake in the region, which was detected in Europe, USA and Russia. So it's detected in seismographs around the world. And buildings actually collapsed in Jericho with this earthquake. The magnitude of this earthquake was 6.5 on the Richter scale. And just to give some comparison, the earthquake in Kobe, Japan, many of you will remember, occurred in 1995, killed 5,000 people. That was 7.2 on the Richter scale. And in San Francisco in 1989, killed 62 people. It collapsed part of the San Francisco-Oakland Bridge. That was 7.1 on the Richter scale. The Richter scale is logarithmic, so these were certainly bigger earthquakes than this one. But this is a substantial earthquake, quite a substantial earthquake. And why the earthquake occurs is because of slippage along what is locally called the Jericho Fault. I have to be very careful here because Bob White's a great expert in earthquakes. But this is part of the fault which runs under the River Jordan. And if we go back to this map, all down here there is a fault because there are two tectonic plates, one over here and one over here, and these two tectonic plates are moving with respect to each other. In fact, this is part of the Great Rift Valley, which I think starts up in Lebanon and comes down here and goes down the Red Sea and ends up in Ethiopia. So some huge the Great Rift Valley, and these two tectonic plates are moving and twisting apart, so you get these the valleys separated by mountain ranges on each side where the two tectonic plates have moved apart. So this is a well-known earthquake region, and this is why earthquakes feature frequently in the Bible, because there were a lot of earthquakes in this region, because we're on to a fault zone. And someone who's studied this earthquake a lot is a Professor Amos Neer, who's a professor of geophysics at Stanford University, and I wrote to him about this because I knew he was working on it, and this is what he wrote to me, and he told me I can quote from it, so I have. He says, during the 1927 earthquake, several ground cracks appeared, together with an outpouring of groundwater. This soil liquefaction phenomenon has been well observed in earthquakes elsewhere. During the earthquake, mudslides occurred along the Jordan near Damia, about 30 kilometers north of Jericho. These temporarily stopped the river flow. So what he's saying is, in this earthquake, the mudslides occurred, and these mudslides occurred at this place Damia, and they temporarily stopped the river's flow. And this is a picture in 1957 of a later earthquake-induced mudslide, which didn't stop the Jordan, but it almost did. And you can see this. So here's the mudslide, and the Jordan has just diverted around it. So it almost stopped the Jordan, but not quite. And what we're saying is that was 1957. In 1927, the earthquake was much larger, a bigger mud flow, and the river's flow was totally stopped until the water could either get round or came over the top, and that took a little time to do. And as we'll see, it takes typically 1 to 2 days. And so, has a similar event happened before 1927? And the answer is yes, it's happened relatively frequently. And Amos Neer says, Adam is now Damia, so he makes this identification, which other scholars do. The site of the 1927 mudslides, which cut off a third of Jordan, such cut-offs, lasting typically 1 to 2 days, have also been recorded in 1906, 1834, 1546, 1534, 1267, and 1160. And then the records run out. But you may think it's not unreasonable to extend it to the time of Joshua. Amos Neer says, the stoppage of the Jordan is so typical of earthquakes in this region that little doubt can be left of the reality of such events in Joshua's time. And so I think what we have is really, I think, quite a convincing mechanism for what probably occurred. We know that earthquake-induced mudslides can stop the Jordan flowing because it's happened a number of times. It happens very roughly every 100 years, but that's very rough, very roughly every 100 years. So it's happened a number of times. When it happens, it occurs at this place, Damia, and we know that linguistically, Damia, because of these consonants, this consonantal root of the word diem is probably the same as ancient Adam. And so we can say, I think with quite a high probability, that the way this earthquake occurred in the time of Joshua was just this. When the writer of the book of Joshua says the water stopped flowing at Adam, and he makes a point of this, he's saying it was almost certainly a scientific mechanism was this earthquake-induced mudslide. So the suggestion, what we're suggesting is that scientific explanation makes sense. It's happened a number of times since, and linguistically we can identify Adam with Damia, and modern Damia is where these earthquakes occur now, and the Old Testament tells us that crossing the Jordan, the water stopped flowing at Adam. So we have this scientific explanation, but the Old Testament regards this as a major miracle of God. So let's have a look at how the ancient Israelites would have thought about miracles and put this in context. If we go back 3,000 years ago, we find that nearly every civilization had many gods, and this is well known, of course, in Egypt, where, as I put, one god controlled the rain, another god the flooding of the Nile, another god controlled the rising of the sun every day, another god the rising of the moon every day. So there are many gods in ancient Egypt. Ancient Israel, we know, was different. They had one God, and in a very real sense, their one God replaced all these other gods. And their God, whereas with the Egyptians, they had one God did one specific thing. It was actually a bit more complicated than that if you study ancient Egypt, but simply one God more or less did a specific thing. In Israel, their God controlled all the forces of nature. And if you read this fascinating dialogue between Moses and Pharaoh at the time of the plagues, you'll see that Moses is talking to Pharaoh, but the underlying battle is between the gods of Egypt and the God of Israel. And Moses is sort of saying, my God is more powerful than your gods. And Pharaoh is sort of, calling his magicians and everything and trying to say, no, my gods are more powerful than yours. Ancient Israel had one God who controlled all the forces of nature. And so, to the ancient Israelites, if an earthquake caused the Jordan to stop, the ancient Israelites would have thought this was the hand of God just as much as if God had sent an angel, or as it were, come down and clicked his fingers to stop the Jordan flowing. What was miraculous about this event was the timing. Just when they were standing on the water's edge, the water stopped flowing. There is a hint, I believe, of an earthquake in the Bible. This is Psalm 114. When Israel came out of Egypt, the sea looked and fled. So that's, I think, a clear reference to the Red Sea, fleeing backwards and letting them cross. The Jordan turned back. The mountains leapt like rams, the hills like lambs. You can tell from other places in the Old Testament that when there's talk of mountains leaping and moving, that actually refers to an earthquake in the mountain. So the mountain leaping like rams is almost certainly a reference to an earthquake. Tremble, O Lord, tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord. And I think maybe traditionally we've interpreted that last sentence as rather figuratively, that the presence of the Lord is so powerful that figuratively the earth trembles. What I'm suggesting is maybe we should look at the literal interpretation of that. Tremble, O earth, being an earthquake. So this is saying these events happened when Israel came out of Egypt. There were also earthquakes. The presence of the Lord caused the earth literally to tremble. And the mountains leaping like rams. Of course, the description of Mount Sinai with the earthquakes on Mount Sinai, the mountain shaking, is a clear, I think, reference to an earthquake there on Mount Sinai. So this is a hint, I think, that earthquakes were involved in one or more of these miracles. If we look at the greatest of all Old Testament miracles, probably at least the most well known, the crossing of the Red Sea, the Bible there is explicit that the mechanism was a natural event. This is what the book of Exodus says. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. So it wasn't that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea and the waters just went back. It was a strong east wind blowing all night. And we don't have time to talk about that miracle, but Bob's mentioned my book, so it is actually discussed in my book, and a mechanism there is given for that. But the Bible here is explicit. This was a natural mechanism, but nevertheless a great miracle. It was God who was in charge, as it were, of this strong east wind. Or if you like, God acted with, in and through this strong east wind. So, what makes both these events, the Red Sea crossing and the Jordan crossing, a miracle, I suggest, is the timing. The Jordan stopped flowing just as the Israelites were on the riverbank. The Red Sea was driven back when the Israelites were trapped there by Pharaoh's army and about to be extinguished by Pharaoh's army if this miracle hadn't have happened at that time. This, I think, is a wonderful psalm, part of Psalm 77, where the psalmist is telling us about miracles, and he starts by saying, you are the God who performs miracles. So the psalmist is saying, I'm going to tell you about miracles and how God may perform them. You display your power amongst the people. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. So notice the psalmist doesn't say thunder or the thunder. He says your thunder. He's ascribing the thunder to God. Your lightning lit up the world. Again, your lightning. The earth trembled and quaked. Again, explicit reference to an earthquake. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters. Though your footprints were not seen, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So what the psalmist is saying here is talking about miracles, but specifically the miracles performed at the time of Moses and Aaron. And I think the most remarkable phrase in this passage is this one, which says, though your footprints were not seen. And so what the psalmist is saying is that God didn't come down and enable the Jordan to be crossed, or enable the Red Sea to be crossed, and he didn't come down in a visible form and walk across, holding the waters back, leaving his footprints, as it were, in the riverbed. It was more subtle than that. God was working in, with, and through nature, and his footprints were not visible. There wasn't this direct evidence of God acting. It was an indirect evidence that God was working in, with, and through nature, and it was the timing which was so important. So I think that's a lovely thing to say. It wasn't if God left a celestial visiting card saying, God was here. It's a bit more subtle than that, but the Israelites clearly recognized that God was working in, with, and through nature to perform these remarkable events. Well, now let's just go back to the crossing of Jordan. Many of you have probably been to Israel, and it's a wonderful country to visit, and have seen the River Jordan. And my reaction when I saw the River Jordan was, I guess, a fairly unchristian reaction in a way. I thought, why didn't they swim across? River Jordan is not that wide, and so you thought, it wouldn't have been a big deal to swim across, or maybe make a raft and go across. Well, the fact is that large quantities of water have been used for irrigation since 1940. So since 1940 in particular, both Israel and Jordan have taken huge quantities of water from the River Jordan. So what we see now isn't what the River Jordan was like before 1940. We're told the Israelites crossed in the spring. The book of Joshua says it was the 10th day of the first month, and the first month of the Hebrew religious calendar is the month of Nisan, which corresponds to our March or April. The first month of their civil calendar is actually 6 months later in the autumn. So this was the 10th day of Nisan, which corresponds to our March or April. It was a spring, and what we know is, what happens every year, is that the source of the Jordan, the main source, is the snow-capped Mount Hermon, and what happens in the spring is the snow melts. And that's why the River Jordan was in flood, because the snow melted, because it was a spring. So we have a consistent story of why the Jordan was particularly wide. And what I'm going to show you now is a photograph taken in the 19th century, before these large quantities of water had been taken for irrigation. And it shows you what the Jordan was like in the 19th century. And it was like this in flood. So you can see it was huge. You can see, I guess that's probably the normal bank of the Jordan, but in flood, it's just flooded its banks, and it is a really large body of water to cross. And because the river Jordan's in flood, all this flood water's coming down, this water's moving very rapidly. And so it was a real barrier to cross. And there was an expedition to the Jordan in the 19th century, and the expedition said, in flood, the Jordan was half a mile wide. So what you see now, I mean, in many cases you go to Israel now, and what you see is, what it was like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. In this case, it wasn't. 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, the Jordan was a massive barrier when it was flooding. And so half a mile wide with the water rushing down, and that's why the Israelites couldn't just swim across. It was a real barrier. And that was a water that, however, stopped in this miraculous way. And then the Israelites just walked across the riverbank. So I'm suggesting that 3,000 years later, we probably do know how the crossing occurred, because I think the story just fits together so well. And where the crossing occurred, with the water actually stopping at ancient Adam, modern Damia. So what can we learn from this? Well, we can learn that, at least in some miracles, God works in, with, and through nature. So when Richard Dawkins and Wikipedia says that natural laws are broken, that is not the case. And if we accept this mechanism for the crossing of the Jordan, then no natural laws were broken for this miracle. God's working in, with, and through nature. His footprints are not seen. So you don't see a supernatural body coming down, as it were. The miracle is in the timing, and the timing is perfect timing. We can speculate on how the miracles are achieved, and I don't want to push this too far at all because it's very, very speculation, but you can speculate how was the timing achieved, and was the leader of the Israelites, Joshua, an active agent in the miracle? And of course we don't know, but it seems to me that he probably was, and he was chosen as a leader because his mind was close to the mind of God. And maybe as the Israelites approached the Jordan and Joshua was leading them, maybe God was saying, you need to speed up a bit to Joshua, you need to slow down a bit. I mean, maybe that was part of achieving this miracle of timing. So this human agent Joshua was involved. So that is speculation, but it seems to me to be plausible. So let's conclude this. Analysis of some miracles, well, the Jordan crossing, and also if you look at the Red Sea crossing, you can make the same conclusion, suggests that they were miracles of timing, and there's a suggestion that God may interact with people to help achieve these miracles of timing. And there's a lovely quotation here from a book written by, I think, a Dutch theologian, Huyckers, Religion and the Rise of Modern Science, which is a really nice book. And Huyckers says, the scientist, even when he is a believer, is bound to try as far as possible to reduce miracles to regularities. The believer, even when he is a scientist, discovers miracles in the most familiar things. So if you look at this first phrase, a scientist is trained to look at everything in terms of mechanisms and regularities. And so we don't switch off our training when we read the Bible. And I think this is the right way to look at all miracles. Let's see if they can be reduced to regularities, if they can be, if there's a natural event which is a mechanism for it. But then we must also discover miracles in the most familiar things. And it helps us to do this because it shows us that God is working in, with, and through nature in our natural world. Let's move on. Different miracle, water from a rock. Just a couple of verses again, very simple explanation, a very simple description. The Lord answered Moses, take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will stand before you by the rock at Horeb, strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. This is Exodus 17th chapter. So a rather remarkable event where Moses has a staff in his hands and he hits this rock and water comes out. Just a few words about interpretation. The rock at Horeb, the Hebrew implies a large, well-known rock. So the phrase the rock of Horeb doesn't mean a little stone or a little pebble. It implies a large rock and probably a well-known rock. The Hebrew strike the rock implies a heavy blow. The authorized version, the King James version, says smite the rock, right? So Moses just didn't tap it with his staff. He took his staff and gave it a good whack, all right? And that's what strike the rock implies. And of course it does seem impossible to most of us in this room, and there's a phrase, getting blood out of a stone and getting water out of a stone would seem to be equally impossible. So again, this is a rather remarkable miracle, but let's just look at it through the eyes of science. Scientifically, a number of rocks are well known to be porous, sandstone and limestone, two of them, and these rocks can absorb very large quantities of water. And when they're underground, we call them aquifers, and we sink wells and boreholes into them to get our water out of them. And in fact, in Cambridge, all the water, we have no reservoirs in or around Cambridge. None of the water in Cambridge, none of the water you drank at breakfast, none of this water comes from reservoirs. It all comes from pipes going underground into water-containing rock, and that's where the Cambridge water comes from. I lived in a house I was at Liverpool before coming to Cambridge, and our house was on the side of a big hill, which was a sandstone hill. And in my garden, which went up high, in Victorian times, the sandstone cliffs had just been cut through in Victorian times. So I had this massive sandstone cliff which had been cut through. And when it rained, water would go into the sandstone and then come pouring out of it. And when the rain stopped, the water would continue to come out of the sandstone cliff for about a couple of hours. You know, just watch the water sort of trickling out, sometimes gushing out of the sandstone cliff for a couple of hours. And this is because the sandstone is porous, holds this large quantity of water, and the water can just come trickling out for many hours afterwards, a number of hours afterwards. Now, in the desert, rocks weather differently from in England. So this sandstone cliff in Liverpool remained a sort of sandstone cliff which was porous on the outside as well as the inside. What happens in the desert is that you get these sandstorms, and sand and organic matter are swept against rocks at high speed, and you get a crust which often develops on the surface of rocks due to this weathering. And Bedouin have a special name for this crust. They actually call it desert varnish, and a lot of their rock art is done on this very smooth surface of this weather surface of the rock. Now, what happens there is, if the water goes into such a rock which has this crust around it, then the water is contained in the rock, and if the crust is broken by a sharp blow, the water can flow out. And so this is a fact well known to geologists, and in my book, because it's too much to type, I've just recounted a more recent incident of this. And this is a book, it's a wonderful book, published in 1936 by Major Jarvis, who was the British governor of Sinai then. So in 1936, Britain, you may remember, some of you or may know, not remember, no, that Britain was in charge of Sinai. We had a governor there, Major Jarvis was the governor, and this is an expedition he describes. He says, the striking of the rock at Rephidim by Moses and the gushing forth of water sounds like a veritable miracle. But the writer, that's Major Jarvis, has actually seen it happen. Some of the Sinai camel corps were halted in a wadi, this is a dried up riverbed, and were digging in the loose gravel accumulated at one of the rocky sides to obtain the water that was slowly trickling through the limestone rock. So here it had been raining, right, but everything was dried up, but this water was just trickling through this limestone rock slowly. The men were working slowly, and the colour sergeant said, "Give it to me," and seizing a shovel from one of the men, he began to dig with great vigour. One of his lusty blows hit the rock, when the polished hard face that forms on weathered limestone cracked and fell away, exposing the soft, porous rock beneath. And out of the porous rock came a great gush of clear water. It is regrettable that the Sudanese Camel Corps hailed their non-commissioned officer with shouts of, "What ho, the prophet Moses." So here you see a modern enactment of this event. And I was interested to read, this was in 2004, when NASA had got this rover on Mars, if you remember, and they were looking for water on Mars. And they'd equipped this rover, this automatic robot-controlled instrument, with a rock abrasion tool on one of its arms. So this rover had a number of devices for scooping up soil. But it also had, on one of its arms, it had a grinder. And this is what the Associated Press report says. to grind a fraction of an inch into the surface of a rock called El Capitan. This was quite a large rock, so the Americans called it El Capitan. The rock's weather surface was ground away so that the rover could examine the material underneath and look for water. So again, here on Mars, the rocks were weathered, they're looking for water. You want to grind away the surface to see if you can detect water underneath. So, what we're saying is that in the desert, this is there's a scientific mechanism for this, and in fact, there's many rocks around the traditional Mount Sinai. In my book, I suggest Mount Sinai is actually in a different place, and my Mount Sinai is a volcano on a very large sandstone mountain called Tadra. It's a table mountain, 6 miles in diameter, it's a huge table mountain. So this will hold huge amounts of water. So maybe this was the rock of Horeb, which was cracked by Moses. So here again we have water from a rock, it violates no natural laws. The story fits what we know from science, that you have to strike a rock to break its crust, you have to give it a good whack to do it, which is what the Hebrew suggests. The inference is you have a large rock, the rock of Horeb, which will contain much water. So here again, there's a scientific mechanism for this miracle that God is working in, with, and through nature. Aristotle talked about miracles, and he said something really rather similar. He said in many miracles, and this is Aristotle's words, he talked about an efficient cause, and that's a natural agent, and then he talked about a final cause. So he says there's a final cause, and that's the will of God. And then the efficient cause is the agent that God uses. And Aristotle says, God will frequently use natural events like earthquakes. But then Aristotle says, if it's a natural event, how do you know it's a miracle? And Aristotle said it's revealed by an extraordinary timing of the event. And that's exactly what we've been seeing in these miracles of crossing the Jordan and, to a somewhat lesser extent, the water from a rock. When the Israelites were really thirsty, this water was provided and the timing was right. There's a second occasion when the water from the rock miracle is described. And let's look at this because it's different in a rather subtle but important way. So this now is in the book of Numbers, not Exodus. And the Lord said to Moses, and they're now at a different place. Before, they're near or at Mount Sinai. Now they're at a place called Kadesh. The Lord said to Moses, speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out water. But Moses doesn't speak to it. He raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out. But the Lord said to Moses, because you did not trust in me, you will not bring this community into the land I gave them. So here, the first time, God says to Moses, strike the rock. Here he says, speak to the rock. But Moses, in fact, didn't do that. He struck the rock. The water did come out. But then it wasn't Moses who led the Israelites into the promised land. It was Joshua. Now, many scholars will say these two events, the striking of the rock, are the same events. But to say that loses the whole point of the story, because the writer is at pains to tell us where it happened. The first one is at Horeb, another name for Sinai. The second one at Kadesh. We think we know where Kadesh is. We think we know where Kadesh is, and it's a considerable distance from Sinai. It's going up towards Beersheba, and it's certainly in that vicinity. So these really are very different places. And the whole point of the story is that the events are not the same. And the point of the story is that you can see for Moses it was actually a great test. The first occasion, Moses struck this rock with his staff and water came gushing out. And then this other large rock, Moses is standing by it, and God says to Moses, speak to the rock. And Moses probably thinks to himself, why? Because I've got my staff here. If I strike it, the same thing will happen again. The water will come out, we'll get the water. But God had said to Moses, speak to the rock. And Moses just didn't have sufficient faith to do that. And the whole implication of this story is that God would have acted differently in both events. Whereas in the first event, God was acting with nature, using the hand of Moses to strike the rock. The second time, the implication of the story is that God would have, as it were, provided his own force to break the crust. The implication of the story was that it would have been, instead of the hand of Moses, as it were, the hand of God would have come down in some way. to break the crust of the rock. And so here, again, in a sense, no natural laws would have been broken. The rock would have been fractured, water would have come out in a way that we can understand in our scientific world, but there was this additional force, the hand of God, which would have been involved. And so it's a very subtle and important difference in these two miracles. So God is here acting in a different way, but in both cases, no physical laws being broken, but this additional force being provided by God. Let's move on rapidly because we're coming up to the end of the day. Let's go to the New Testament, walking on water. Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. Then Peter got out of his boat, walked on the water, and came to Jesus. I don't know if you saw this story. It's reported in most of the popular newspapers in 2006. There was a scientist called Doran Noff at Florida State University who wrote a paper saying that if you go back to Jesus' day, the Sea of Galilee could have had frozen patches on it, and that, Peter and indeed Jesus walked on these frozen patches. And I looked up the paper. It's actually a rather good paper, and it is well argued, but I think you have to say it is rather unlikely, or extremely unlikely. So although as scientists we should look for natural events, we shouldn't push things too far, and I think we're pushing things too far. So this does seem to be something which science cannot easily explain. But nevertheless, I think science can make a contribution to our understanding. So how do we understand what sort of mechanism could Peter have walked on the water? What can science say about this? Well, I think there's at least two different explanations. One is that God locally made gravity not operate. So, where Peter was walking on the water, the force of gravity was suspended, so Peter didn't sink down into the water. That's one way of looking at it. So the law of gravity was locally broken, and it didn't happen. But there's a different way of looking at it, and the different way of looking at it is that that law was not broken. Gravity kept operating, and the reason Peter didn't fall was that God provided an additional uplifting force. So gravity working everywhere, but God providing this upholding of Peter as he walked across the water. And then when Peter's faith failed, the sort of arms, as it were, of God went away, and Peter sank. It wasn't gravity being switched on and off, it was this additional force. And I think scientifically, this is a much better way of looking at things, because as scientists we know if you can't just locally stop gravity happening without having huge ramifications elsewhere. So scientifically, just to keep the forces of nature happening as usual, but then to have an additional force is much more attractive scientifically. And I suggest it's much more attractive theologically, this idea that God provides this additional force upholding Peter as he walks across the water. Move on to the last miracle, the resurrection. Can science explain the resurrection? Well, I think we have to say it can't without present knowledge, and probably never will. I'm a great fan of science, so that's why I don't say certainly it never will, because maybe one day we'll have more insights into this. But it does look here as if natural laws are being broken. It looks like that. And so what we're seeing is there's actually a whole spectrum of miracles where in many of them God is working with and through nature, and in some cases that seems not to be the case. So nevertheless though, how do we think of this as scientists or as rational people? And the first thing to recognise is the breaking of natural laws is not just a problem for scientists, it's a problem for theologians as well, because the whole biblical picture of God is of a consistent God, and this rings through the Bible. Jesus Christ the same today, yesterday and forever, this consistency of Jesus. Or I'm just trying to think of this Old Testament verse, and my cold is preventing this. But is it summer and winter, autumn and harvest shall not fail? It's something like that. We all know what it is. So the whole picture throughout the Bible is a consistent God. And so we have to say, if the God who created our universe, including our earth, is a consistent God, would he break his own natural laws? And I'd like to just give you an analogy, which I call the music analogy, which I find very helpful, and most analogies you shouldn't push too far, but I think it's quite helpful in answering this question. Let's consider that there's a piano in this room, and there's a pianist playing this piano, and he's playing it from memory with no music. So some of you might gather behind the pianist, and you just watch where the pianist's fingers are going, and you may notice that as the pianist is playing, he plays mainly on white notes, but occasionally, instead of playing this note F, he plays an F sharp. And he does this, every time. He plays an F sharp instead of an F. Then by standing behind this person playing, if you know about music, you can determine what is known as the key signature for this music. So the key signature is the instructions the composer gives to the player, and at the start of every line of music there's this key signature written, which tells the player, instead of playing, for this particular piece of music, instead of playing F, you play F sharp. And that's the instructions that the composer makes. So by looking at where the player puts his fingers, you can say what the key signature is. And in a sense, that's what scientists try to do with our universe. We look at clues in our universe, and we try to construct the key signature of the universe, the rules which underpin how the universe operates. But then, look at the pianist a bit longer, and you may find that sometimes he doesn't play an F sharp when he should be playing it. Sometimes he just plays the natural F and not an F sharp. And on other times, he may in fact play a C sharp, or an E flat, or an A flat. And he may put these notes in, which are not in the key signature, but which are called accidentals, and which the composer has just inserted into the music at that place. And if it's a really great composer, then these accidentals make better music rather than less music. And I've tried this, and you can try this experiment. Find a great piece of music and play it, if you play the piano or another instrument, play it with and without the accidentals, and you'll find it's the accidentals which really make that music great. So the composer is free to break his own key signature because he is the composer. But if it's a great composer, the accidentals make more sense rather than less sense. They make better music. And so the analogy then is obvious, isn't it? If God is the creator of the universe, and he has set up mechanisms, as it were, by which the universe operates and normally operates, that's the key signature, because he is the creator, he is free to break his own mechanisms. But because he is a consistent God, if he breaks his mechanisms, it has to make more sense rather than less sense. And this is how, if you look at how the New Testament describes the resurrection, it's this sort of philosophy which I think underpins the writing about the resurrection. This is the first, the earliest, as it were, recorded, well, let's go back on that day. This is just the day of Pentecost, where Peter is standing up in the book of Acts chapter 2, and he's speaking about the resurrection. It's just 7 weeks after the crucifixion, so it's the first recorded sermon, I think, about the crucifixion that we have. So this is first recorded sermon about the crucifixion, and what Peter says, he says, God raised him, that's Jesus, from the dead, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. So Peter's not saying it's a capricious act of God. What Peter is saying is, look, Jesus was a son of God, and because Jesus was a son of God, the resurrection was not something which was incredible, it was something which was inevitable. Right? Death could not hold Jesus because he was the son of God. And so the resurrection, although it may involve breaking some natural laws, nevertheless, it had to happen because it's consistent with consistent God. The Son of God cannot remain dead. And so I find that music analogy really quite helpful. So, right, let's come to the end. Could scientists believe in miracles? I believe that many miracles, and possibly most miracles, are actually miracles of timing where God is working in, with, and through nature. And I think this is a particular case with many of the Old Testament miracles. No scientific laws are broken, but God is working in, with, and through nature, and it's the timing which is the miraculous event. And this shouldn't be a problem for scientists. Some miracles, like the resurrection, I think are more like an accidental on a music score where God is acting differently, and because he is God, he is free to act differently. But scientists or religious or Christians can believe in such miracles without compromising their science, because science is looking at the way the world normally operates in and has nothing to say, it can have nothing to say, about these very rare accidentals. So, normal way of performing miracles to work in, with and through nature. God occasionally provides additional forces, which surely he did at the resurrection. These additional forces which provided this resurrection body of Jesus. And just bearing in mind how God achieves his timing, if it's true that humans are involved in God achieving his timing, then if we're to be used in miracles which happen today, then our minds, I think, need to be attuned to the mind of God so that God can use us in the way that God used Joshua. And I think that's the last, yes it is, that's the last slide. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. If we can impose on your slot
Yes, of
row
course,
for
yes.
another half an hour, perhaps 25 minutes. But I'm sure people may have questions to raise on this topic that's starting.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I actually found it very interesting, particularly your explanations of the miracles of the Old Testament. It reminded me a lot of actually going back 150 years before, when everybody thought that the Iliad and the Odyssey were just fictional accounts and people believe in them. But then, of course, Schliemann came along and said, oh no, we have to take it literal.
Yeah.
And started digging and found the evidence of Troy. And of course, in those accounts, several gods were involved as well, Athena in particular and so on. By the same token, should we then not have to admit that Athena and Zeus performed miracles as well and used nature to interfere in human affairs?
Right, okay, so that's a good question, thank you. So the question is that what has been found recently is that a number of events which are regarded as legends, so the story of Troy, are found to have some historical basis, and these places are being found historically. And I think that is clearly right, that a lot of ancient writing, which people have interpreted as legends, we now find have a basis in fact. So I'd agree with that part of the question. Now I don't know enough about the story to know enough about the miracles which were done there, and that's the second part of the question.
Yeah,
as
that's
to whether, because these other gods were said to perform miracles, and so I just don't know enough about that part of the story. As a Christian, I would say you have to be very careful here. But I would point out there's some interesting points in the Bible where, you know, some of the early plagues, the magicians of Pharaoh were able to reproduce these, not the later plagues, but some of the early ones. And I think, and again, this fits with those being natural events which happened. And, you know, God, and you have to be very careful here, but God can use non-Christians, and God can use pagans. And of course, a great example of this is the Magi who came to welcome Jesus. Right? So the Magi were astrologers who worshipped, you know, what we would say false gods, and they came and God used them. And I think an early Christian called Irenaeus, who was an early church father, they obviously struggled with this. You know, the church fathers struggled with this. But then Irenaeus said God was demonstrating his power, that he could even use pagans to come and, you know, announce the birth of Jesus. So I would say we shouldn't limit our God and think that he can, you know, use other people's beliefs to accomplish his purposes. That's not a complete answer to your question, I know, because I'm not familiar with the miracles that are in these stories.
The approach you're taking is sort of natural for a scientist, in that you take a miracle and rather than just say, okay, all the laws are broken and it's supernatural, is there a natural explanation? But is there occasions where we want to go the other way? So, for instance, the story of Jonah and the whale, I often see that described, and then somebody will whip out a sort of a story of there is a story apparently of some guy who was supposed to have been swallowed by a whale, and I've seen this with evangelical Christians particularly, where they start to try to describe a natural mechanism.
Yes.
And my reaction to that is actually always to go the other way and say, well, actually, I don't see how that is possible in the slightest. I think it's an apocryphal story. Therefore, I would go away from natural mechanisms and go to a supernatural, miraculous sort of, like the resurrection of Christ. And Jesus does actually say, just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale, and it sort of compares the two events almost. So are there times, even as a scientist, where you would perhaps go the other way and say, no, there isn't a natural explanation for that, I would invoke a miracle.
Yes.
That's all it.
No, I'm sure you're absolutely right. I think the science has to be good science, and that's the important point. And I think, well, to my mind, and I haven't studied this miracle, but to my mind, the idea that any fish, whale or anything else could swallow a man and that man could remain alive for, is it 3 days? Then seems to me to be pretty incredible. So I haven't studied it, but my first reaction is to say that would not be good science. And so we should go the other way, and I agree with you.
Let's get to the back.
Rather than going the other way, because on many miracles we look at and say, well, that's just a story, that's a myth, that conveys the truth, but it's not in any way, because I looked at it and used my science and think, well, that's so improbable. It's not likely to be based on any kind of literal truth whatsoever.
Sorry, first question.
Well, rather than going the other, do you look at, if you can't prove something, or if you can't get your mind around it by using scientific techniques, do you tend to go towards saying, well, that probably happened, but I can't explain why science can't explain why, or do you tend to look and say, well, it's probably just a myth, it doesn't express any literal truth whatsoever?
Right, so the question is, the approach to miracles. So my first approach would be to see if there is, because I'm trained as a scientist, but I actually think it is the right approach, if you're trained as a scientist or not, is to look at the miracles and say, was there a natural mechanism here? And if there is, it's no less a miracle. We were very careful to say that. So I would say the crossing of Jordan, the crossing of the Red Sea, if these mechanisms I just are the correct explanation, then it's no less a miracle. And in a sense, it's almost greater a miracle to appreciate this wonderful time which happened. But then you say, if it isn't, if there's not a natural mechanism, you can rule that out, then I think you then have to say that either God was acting specially, or it might have not happened in that way, literally. It might have meant to be taken as a parable. And we mustn't rule out myth and parable in the Bible, and Jesus talked in parables a lot. So there may be cases where the miracle was actually a parable. I think in the case of the Exodus, you have so much geographical... it seems clear when you read the Exodus story, the writers are trying to say these events really happened, and they happened here. If you go back to the serpent speaking in early Genesis, for example, then or a tree called the tree of life, then you may, you go to Revelation, there's a tree called the tree of life, and very few people would take that literally, so why should you in the book of Genesis? And so, serpent speaking, maybe that is not meant to be taken literally, maybe that's a figurative story. So you're absolutely right, you should look at other alternative explanations, but I think first of all, see if there is a natural interpretation.
Did you have a comment? The earthquake at Dharmia, we don't know, we don't say, and I don't know how we would know, but if there's an earthquake, it seems highly likely that people are going to be killed, and that they're going to be injured, and that their lives are going to be destroyed. That doesn't sound like a miracle idea. It doesn't sound like a great thing to attribute to God, to me. And it really suggests that there is a choice going on, and that some people have been chosen, and that others have been deliberately destroyed, if we call it a miracle. Is that what you're really suggesting? That we have to suggest that in making a miracle, God would choose to destroy some people in favour of others?
No, I think it's a really good question. I'm not saying that, but it's a good question which needs thinking through. we don't know if people were living around, or were destroyed around Adam. I mean, we just don't know that. We know that, and Bob would be much more expert than me on this, but I mean, the way our world is, we have earthquakes in our world, and that is the way our world is. And although it may seem to us that our world could be different, it may actually turn out, because our world is so fine-tuned, that earthquakes are an inevitable feature of the way the world is. But Bob will, much better on this than I am. But I mean, I have seen a paper published which says that if you have any object in the universe composed of rocks as we know them, that's greater than has more than a certain diameter, then earthquakes are inevitable because the so-called hoop stresses exceed the strength of the rocks. So you go out to anywhere in the universe where there's solid bodies which have a greater radius than a certain critical radius, earthquakes happen there. And you need this size of our Earth to attract the oxygen in our atmosphere. So our Earth has to be bigger than a certain size to have an oxygen in the atmosphere. So it may be that earthquakes are inevitable. And then people are killed. And that's a disaster, and it's very hard to explain. But what I'm saying is that God works with the way the world is and can produce these miracles through that. But it's a very good question, but it's a subtle point. I mean, I don't know if you want to add to anything.
Well, yeah, the scientific point is that if this Earth didn't have earthquakes, it would not be the fertile place that we can live in, would not be fit for human habitation, because it's the earthquakes and the volcanoes that recycle nutrients from depth, minerals and so on. So I think there's little doubt that the planets on which are frozen up and don't have plate tectonics are certainly not suitable for life. But in fact, we don't have any other planets that are suitable for life, actually. And I think it's the dynamic Earth that maintains an equilibrium that does make it suitable for habitation, for life. But the theological point, which is, I think, more interesting, is that God certainly does, in his justice, annihilate some people who he says are wicked. And the consequence of the people of Israel crossing the Jordan was that they destroyed all the people in Jericho. And the Bible explicitly says that was God's judgment on them. It wasn't just a capricious act. He destroyed them because they are wicked. And the people in Adamah were part of the same nation as Jericho, presumably. They were just up the road. And it may well be that he was doing two things at once. He was letting the Israelites in, but also destroying a wicked nation. And certainly the biblical, we shouldn't sort of meander our way around this. The biblical story is quite clear that God is a God of justice. And justice is something we all demand and live by, and sometimes he destroys wicked people, and sometimes he uses his own methods for doing that. Sometimes he uses the people of God for doing it. Sometimes he used wicked people to discipline the people of God, the other way around, Babylonians taking them into exile, Egypt treating them the way they did, and so on. Moab. I mean, I think we have to be robust in our view of God's action in the world, that he is a holy and just God, and he does punish wickedness. That's the Christian gospel. Anyway, that's two different points. Yes, Colin.
I might have a question. Probably, I think with the Old Testament, it needs to be clear that it's not written as history the day after the event happened, is it? It's an oral tradition that spent a long time in gestation before it was committed to some kind of record. And so, as a blow-by-blow account, it probably is not accurate history. But that doesn't mean that there's not a germ of truth within the story. So that's just a comment. The question I have is what's your take on the extended day saga that happens a few chapters on in Joshua? Because we've recently had the NASA story appear within our church circuit. So do you know that we're not aware of the strange NASA story? It's not true. No, I think it's not true. But I wonder what your take on is it extended? The story is there's a chap who claims that NASA discovered that if they ran their computers backwards to about 3,500 on Wednesday the 20th of whatever, time stopped or something. It's just a nonsense story. And if you do Google extended day hoax or extended day, you get a myriad of pages, and people from arch fundamentalist websites through to arch secularists all say it's, I'll be polite, nonsense. But I just wonder what your take on it was. It seems, because people read it and they say, fantastic, science proves the Bible. And then you say, actually it's a load of hogwash and people come and shout at you for doing it.
Right, right. Okay, so no, I mean, I've heard this Nessa story before. I mean, it's just wrong, as you say. I mean, it's bad science, it is wrong, you know, there's no basis for it. The story of the sun standing still, I think, in Joshua and the extended time. I don't know. I mean, I think we have to say some things we don't know, and I would like to look at that story in more detail in the future, but I just haven't had time to do that, so I don't know.
You need time to stand still.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. But could I just say something briefly, though, because I think, just going back to what you said at the start, which I think is an important issue about, you know, this how historical the Old Testament is and oral tradition and so on, and people are quite divided on this. But what we know for reasonable certainty is that I think if you look at, I mean, I don't want to plug my book, but if you look at my book, where I look at some of the miracles in really more detail than the crossing of Jordan, what you find is that when you look at these miracles through the eyes of science, the details are actually remarkably correct. And so, and it's as if they actually were written by eyewitnesses. And it's hard to escape that conclusion. On the other hand, Hebrew experts tell me that if you look at the first 5 books of the Bible, then the Hebrew in which they are written is the Hebrew of the 8th or 9th centuries BC. It's quite hard to bracket, but that sort of time, whereas even the events, I mean, the Exodus was probably around 1300 BC. You know, the form in which we have the first 5 books of the Bible is many centuries. And I mean, there's a broad mixture of people here, I know, but there are many, fundamentalists may not like this, but there are many centuries after the events happened. But nevertheless, the details in those stories, if you analyse them, I think are remarkably accurate. And so, rather than the version you suggest of oral tradition being passed down and then misrepresented, I suspect that isn't right. I suspect what we know from both Egypt and Babylon is that people could write, you know, at the time of the Exodus. People did do writings, and in fact, you know, you can go to ancient Egypt now and see the writing which was done at the time of Ramesses II, so people could do writing. But what happened in Egypt and Babylon were that these early writings were passed down, and scribes would reproduce them faithfully, but they would also do some updating. So if a place name had changed in this period of time, they'd often put in the new place name rather than the original place name, for example. And I think that is, to my mind, a more likely explanation of these, the Book of Exodus, for example, that in fact it is eyewitness accounts which were written down, probably written down. I mean, you can't tell if it's all written, but maybe written down. And then scribes would faithfully reproduce it, but they would update as they went along. And the final form we have is probably the 8th century BC. I mean, it's really hard to pinpoint it. That's what I suspect is the situation. And a number of scholars would say that now.
It's also the case, isn't it, that oral history was passed down in those cultures much more faithfully than it is in our culture.
Yeah.
Because they put a very high priority on it, particularly in your forebears, your ancestry, which is why the Bible has these lists of forebears, because it was so important. So,
Yes.
I mean, I agree with what you said, that they were writing things down, but also oral history was a lot more reliable than it is now. So.
Yes.
We've had 3 possibilities: myth, additional forces, or working through nature.
Mm.
I'm thinking my way to a 4th possibility. That is that miracles actually happen quite often, and the human mind has a great disposition to be awed by the idea that everything should go right. So, you know, I made that split-second decision, and it was just right. And all kinds of things, like if you take that particular stance on your life, you can find miracles happening. And sometimes the miracles seem to be a bit sparse. made you think, well, maybe my attitude isn't right, maybe my approach to life isn't right. And this may be, actually maybe not a fourth one, it may be one of God performing through natural, I don't know. It's just another way of saying the same thing.
No, I do think you're right, and I think if most of us look back at our own lives, we can find events in the past which will say these were just chance events, but looking back, they were really important events, either for us or for other people. And, you know, I think from the eyes of a Christian, you can see the hand of God at work there. So in fact, at one level they were chance events, this chance meeting on a corner of a street, but on another level, they were actually, the hand of God was there, working through these events.
So it's a way of looking at things.
Yes. And I think, you know, that's a really important concept to have.
And it's a facility that we as human beings have.
Yes.
And we could put it in lots of different ways. We could put it that, well, that's a particular approach to life where you can see these things happening in your life. But you wouldn't necessarily have to say it was the hand of God. Although maybe you wouldn't find any other way of talking about it, I don't know.
I mean, I think, you know, we have to have balance. We have to be careful not to ascribe the hand of God to everything, as it were, perhaps. And there are some sort of chance events and these things happen. That's life. But I think most people go down the extreme. And I think if you are living a life, you know, much closer to the God that I'm living, then I think these events, you can read the stories of people like Muller and Bristol. I mean, remarkable events happen very, very frequently where God is actually clearly very much involved in their life and the life of the people they meet. And so, as the quotation says, you can see these miracles in everyday life, which I'm sure are happening. And they are these sort of miracles of timing, these events which we otherwise say are events.
Improbable, but natural.
There's a couple of hairs.
Yes, just to follow on from that, where does coincidence fit into all this? If you can explain miracles through natural forces and relations, and obviously there's a timing factor there, but that depends on your point of view then. You can see the same thing as just being a coincidence or a miracle.
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree with that, but I give an example in my book. I think you're absolutely right. So this crossing of the Jordan, you could just say, they were lucky. All right? I mean, roughly every 100 years, the Jordan stops like this, and the Israelites were just lucky. They were at the water's edge, and this event happened, and it wasn't the hand of God at all. It was just, you know, luck. And that's a very reasonable thing to say. And what I say in my book is that what you find in the Exodus, you find event after event after event is like this. And then you begin to say, well, maybe it wasn't just a chance event. Maybe there is some causal, you know, the hand of God is working. And I give an example in my book, which I'll say now, because it happened while I was writing the book. And that is, I'd had a shower in my house and came downstairs, and in the kitchen, you know, about 3 hours later, this wet patch appeared on the kitchen ceiling. It appeared about 3 hours later, so I thought, it can't be connected with the shower because the water comes through much more rapid than that. And then it was only a small patch of water, so it dried up very rapidly, and I forgot about it, as it were, and had another shower. And I looked, had the shower, and I came down, of course, I looked on the kitchen ceiling, and no wet patch there, so I thought, oh no, you know, nothing to do with the shower. But then I happened to look up a few hours later, and there's a wet patch there on the ceiling. And patch of wet plaster, so I thought, because, you know, I'm pretty hard-nosed scientist, I thought, it can't be linked, you know, because the water can't take 3 hours to come through. But when it happened the third time I had a shower, I thought, you know, this just isn't, they're connected events, this isn't just chance. And then, of course, it wasn't, and we had to have the bathroom floor up, and I had a shower, and the water was getting around the edge of the bath, you know, it's getting through, and then this rather tortuous path under the bathroom floor was getting through, and it took 3 hours for that to happen. So I think if you had one miracle in the Old Testament, which was a miracle of timing, you'll be very justified in saying, pure chance, just luck. But when you have miracle after miracle, where the timing is just right, then I think you begin to say, look, this really is the hand of God, because the chances of this happening mathematically just become, you know, infinitesimally small. So it's more rational to say, look, God is working with and through nature and achieving this timing.
You've touched on the tectonic plates under the Jordan, and I wonder if you thought that might be a pointer towards a future miracle of timing, where the Bible, I think, refers to mountain splitting, and I think the Mediterranean Sea linking up with internal waters.
Well, yes, I mean, I think that whole area is subject to quite severe earthquakes, and if there are future prophecies referring to these sorts of events in that region, then an earthquake is a very plausible mechanism, because we know that earthquakes are there. So, but prophecy is another issue we won't get into here.
Just that one of the things we talk about is the consistency of God. And surely it's consistent with what we call free will debate, but it's consistent with us being granted free will, that each of these miracles shot just short of the footprints appearing, which would be absolutely complete evidence. Therefore, how is Dawkins going to be able to say, I don't believe in God? In other words, we must have free will enough to put these pieces together and make a universe where there isn't a God. It's a moral choice we make in terms of our Christian commitment. It's not an offer you can't refuse, like in The Godfather. It's an offer you can refuse.
Yes. Okay, I think that is a very good point. I think that's right. If God had been clearly evident in these miracles, then people would almost be forced to believe in God because it would be so apparent. And so it's more subtle. So it's a good point.
Well, the New Testament does say even if somebody was raised from the dead, you wouldn't necessarily believe in him. That's manifestly true, isn't it? Even though there are hundreds of witnesses. So some people do and some people don't.
Was it really dead?
Yeah.
Probably if you would say that the New Testament is particularly full of accidental miracles rather than timing miracles, in the sense of the turning water into wine, raising of Lazarus, you can't say they're timing. Is there something about the New Testament miracles that say this is a special time?
I think that may well be right. I mean, I just haven't had time to analyse, as it were, enough miracles. But my impression is that if you take the healing miracles of Jesus, then clearly they seem to be not natural events, but if you like, accelerated processes. But there's a sort of hint, in when Jesus cures a blind man, it has to be a two-stage process, if you remember. So to start with, this blind man says, Jesus says, can you see? And the blind man says, I see people as trees walking, and there's something not quite right. So Jesus, has another go, as it were. And it's almost there as if, it is natural events being accelerated, but still based on natural healing processes. But I agree, I think most of the miracles of timing, one would say, would be in the Old Testament.
Well, I think on that note, it's exactly past, and we should let your throat recover. Let's thank Colin once again.